this is the Goldees Offset, made from 1/4-inch thick steel with an insane cooking capacity, which you can buy for $4,250. And this is the Old Country Pecos, made from much thinner steel and a much smaller cooking capacity, but with a modest price of $4.99. Today I'll be cooking a brisket on both smokers to see if the Goldees Offset performance and experience can justify the massive price difference. And more importantly, I'll find out if the Old Country Pecos brisket can hold its ground in a head-to-head taste test with the Goldees brisket.
That is so odd.
So to make this test as fair as possible, I picked up 2 briskets that were almost identical, and then I trimmed and seasoned them the exact same way. Now, before we get started with this test, I wanted to cover a few very important things. So the first thing that you may notice, and you can kind of see it behind me, is that the Pecos that I'm using is modded. So the first thing is the stack is extended. I just used a pipe that I picked up from Lowe's, and basically what that does is it just increases the pull so that the smoker runs a lot better and I get a faster convection inside of my smoker. And then I removed the baffle plate inside of the cook chamber, and I did that because the baffle plate basically inhibits the airflow, so it pushes the hot air down, and then when it comes up, it hits right under the brisket and it makes the bottom of the brisket crispy. So by removing the baffle plate, that problem is eliminated. And I did this because I want the Pecos to have the best chance possible to go up against the Goldee smoker. And plus the mods are super cheap. I think it was like 20 bucks to do all the changes on the Pecos. So if you have a Pecos or if you're planning to get one, I highly recommend that you get these mods. The second thing is I am using the all-new Tyfer Sync to help me track this cook. The Tyfer Sync comes with 2 probes and a 4-in-1 base which connects to the probes via Bluetooth version 5.4, which will give you the most stable connection on the market. And because of that strong Bluetooth connection, the Tyfer Sync actually works through my 1/4-inch thick steel Goldee smoker, giving me reliable and accurate readings. Inside each of the probes is 5 sensors. 4 of them go inside of the meat, and with its cutting edge algorithm will actually give you the most accurate reading from those 4 sensors. So I don't have to worry about accidentally hitting a fat pocket or connective tissue, and I know that I'm not getting inaccurate data. And finally, the 5th sensor is on the end of the thermometer, which reads the ambient temperature inside the smoker. So I can know the exact temperature of the hot air that's cooking the brisket right at grate level. And thanks to the app that connects to the base, not only can I check the temperature of the briskets and also the ambient temperature in the smoker from anywhere, but I can actually track the spikes of when I'm adding wood to the smokers and also the dips as the wood breaks down during the entire cooking process. And that data is put together in a very easy to track graph that you can actually see the trends throughout the cook. This will give me a very clear picture of both of the smoker's performance, and thanks to the Tyfer Sync, I'll be able to share that data with you throughout the video. Also, each probe is clearly marked with the numbers 1 and 2, so I can keep track of which brisket is which even after I pull the briskets to rest. For this cook, I'm going to make the Goldees brisket probe 1 and the Pecos brisket probe 2. So I've been using the Tyfer Sync over the last few months, both at home and also as I've been traveling to different barbecue places, and I can confidently say that this thermometer is an absolute game changer for everyday home cooks. And right now, Tyfer is doing a Black Friday sale, which is live right now, which gives you 20% off. No codes needed, just use my link in the description below to get the Tyfer Sync today. Thank you, Tyfer, for sponsoring this video. So with the probes in, let's go ahead and get these briskets onto the smokers. So again, I just put the briskets on, so we're super early into the cook, but I'm already seeing some major differences between how the 2 pits are running. And the big difference I'm seeing off the bat is the pull. So when I'm checking the pull on a smoker, there's 2 things that I look at. So the first thing I look at is when I open the door of the smoker, do I get blasted with heat, almost like an oven, or do I feel a more gentle heat coming out? And the second thing I look for is on the smokestack, how is the smoke coming out? So on the Pecos, you can actually see the smoke coming out, and it's almost like soggy, like it's like coming out, but it's kind of like falling down. It doesn't have like a nice trajectory of like shooting out of the smokestack like you see in the Goldees Offset. But will this difference in the pull have an effect overall on the briskets? Well, from my experience, I will say absolutely yes. But I guess we'll find out once the briskets are done. Another thing I noticed, which is a lot more obvious, is just how vastly different the capacities are in these 2 smokers. So in the Pecos, you would be lucky to squeeze in 2 briskets. You gotta remember that the firebox is connected directly to the cook chamber. So pretty much the whole cooking grate from the middle all the way to the end where the firebox is pretty much unusable, compared to the Goldee Smoker where the brisket almost looks like a hot dog in a hallway. So apparently the Goldee Smoker is able to cook 6 briskets at once, but next week I'm actually going to cook 7 briskets on this smoker. So if you don't want to miss that video, make sure you subscribe. So I'm going to let these 2 smokers rock for a few hours, and then I'll come back and give you some data that I found with the Typer Sync.
Okay, so we're about 4.5 hours into the cook, and I'm gonna kind of have some of the data from the Typer Sync on the screen while I talk about each of the experiences that I've had so far. For the Goldee's pit, I was able to do my very traditional way of cooking brisket. So I started out the cook really slow and smoky, and then brought it up to like the 250, 275 range, and kind of just kept feeding it and keeping it in that range. Had the damper set to 25%, and yeah, I mean, it's pretty smooth sailing so far. But this is a very different story in comparison to the Old Country Pecos. So out the gate, I tried to go low and smoky as well, and I put 2 very thin splits. So in the Goldee's pit, I'm putting regular size splits. In the Pecos, I'm using half splits. So I had 2 half splits inside of the smoker, and off the jump it was at like 300 degrees. So first off, I tried to control the airflow by putting on a cap over the stack to kind of act as the damper, and I have it shut about 50%. And then on the firebox, I completely closed the door and then used the firebox damper and put it down to like 25%. And at that level of airflow, I'm able to keep the pit rocking at like 250, 275. But because I'm not using that much wood, I'm using like 2 half splits of wood at a time, my coal bed is very small. So I have to really be on top of adding wood, because if I miss a cycle, then the coal bed will be like completely dead. So as you can imagine, in the Pecos, I'm having to come out like every 15 to 20 minutes to add more wood. Another thing, even though the Pecos, for the majority of the cook so far in these like 5-ish hours, it's been running hotter than the Goldee's pit, but the Goldee's brisket is actually further along in terms of the bark development. I think this is because, like I said before, I think the Goldee's just pulls better than the Old Country Pecos, go figure. But hopefully by the end of the cook, the Old Country Pecos brisket will be able to catch up, and it'll still be a really good brisket. Okay, let's talk about bark. So we are about 10 hours and like 15 minutes since I first put the briskets on the smokers. And since the last update, as I've been monitoring the cook, I noticed that the barks on both of the briskets were starting to look very different, actually pretty early on. At about the 8-hour mark, the Goldee's brisket was like getting a really nice dark color and was releasing moisture and was kind of like mellowing out. Like it looked like nice and flat. But the Pecos brisket was doing this weird thing on the crust of the brisket. Like the fat was starting to kind of like bubble up. And it reminded me of the same bark that kind of forms when you're cooking a brisket in a pellet smoker. And I also noticed that the Pecos brisket was kind of like puffing up. It didn't have that same like relaxed look. So wild stuff. I honestly think that the briskets are going to taste very different, but right now the Goldee's brisket is actually ready to wrap. I think the Pecos brisket still has like an hour or so to go before it's ready to wrap, but I'm gonna go ahead and pull the Goldee's brisket right now. Look at that. Beautiful. This brisket is insane. That's not a Texas brisket. I don't know what is. So I'm gonna get the Typer probe back in there. And once the Pecos brisket is done, I'm gonna rest both of them until they reach an internal of 145 degrees Fahrenheit, and then it'll be ready to slice and see how these briskets turned out. The Pecos brisket. You know what? This one actually looks really good too. It is a little bit crispier on the edges, but other than that, man, I mean, coming from a $500 smoker, that is not bad at all. Alright, so I went ahead and let the briskets rest overnight because I think the daylight will allow us to see a lot of the differences between the 2 briskets in terms of the fat render, the bark in the daylight. So after using both the Pecos smoker and the Goldee smoker side by side, I can confidently say that the Goldee smoker was much easier to use. It was a lot more forgiving. So there were certain times during the cook where, you know, I'm running 2 smokers, I have kids, I'm also like editing the next barbecue story, so you know, sometimes the pit gets out of control. And even though the Goldee's pit got up to like 325 at some points, like the brisket was like super chill. There was like no signs of puffing, no like weird things going on with the bark. Also, I need to mention that yesterday was a pretty nice day. I mean, it was super cloudy, but it was like 65 to like 70 degrees. But because the Pecos is made with like really thin metal, I think that managing the fire in the Pecos, if it was like super cold, would have been extremely difficult. So keep that in mind as well. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and get a couple slices from each of the brisket, and then we can compare and contrast them, try them out, and see which one is better. Okay, so both briskets look phenomenal. This is easily the best brisket I've ever made on a Pecos. But there are a few minor differences. So the first thing that was like really apparent to me is that on the Pecos brisket, the point slice, actually, you can see it kind of looks a little overcooked. Yeah, you can just see like the muscle fibers right there. They're kind of like, I can't explain it. It's like you can't see the like fat and connective tissue that's been broken down in between them. Whenever I see that, I know that the brisket is a little overcooked. And I think it's just because of that radiant heat of the firebox being right next to the cook chamber and having that open flame there compared to that pipe that sticks out for the Goldee smoker. The pipe blocks the direct heat and all you're getting is that nice convection inside of the cook chamber. And you might be thinking, oh, you just overcooked the Pecos brisket, that's your fault. But maybe that's true, but what I'm also noticing is that the fat render on the Pecos brisket is not as good as the Goldee's brisket. So again, go really close. You can see that the fat is nice and yellow, but it didn't like reduce down as much as the Goldee's brisket. So this is the Goldee slice. You see how like the fat is just like really like low right on the meat, and it's kind of like even across. There's like no white at the base of the fat level. So just on the looks test alone, like the Goldee's brisket is superior. I'm telling you, like if you just cook briskets in your backyard once in a while and you don't know like the little nuances of brisket, you're gonna be like, these briskets are identical. If I had to put a grade on it, like this Goldee's brisket, if this Goldee's brisket is like an A+, and this Pecos brisket is like a B+, A-, like somewhere around that range. So again, really close, both really good briskets, but what's more important is how does it taste. So let's go ahead. I'm gonna try the Goldee's briskets first and then the Pecos brisket, and then I'll let you know my thoughts. That is so odd. Okay, so first off, this was my very first time smoking choice Angus from Sam's Club, and the beef flavor on this brisket is next to nothing. I'm actually pretty disappointed. I thought that I was gonna get that nice like Texas style Angus beef flavor with these briskets, but yeah, I'm not getting it. But I will say that there is distinct differences between these two briskets, believe it or not. Okay, so the first thing I'll say is that the flat, it was about the same on both. There's not really much of a difference. The only thing, and this goes for the entire both briskets, is that I'm getting way more smoke flavor on the Goldee's brisket. And it's a nice smoke flavor. It's not like overpowering. It's just like that perfect smoke that I'm looking for when I'm cooking a brisket. Second thing I want to say is that on the point, there is like a textural difference. So like I said before, the point on the Pecos was a little overcooked. So you would think that even though it looks not as pleasing, once you eat it, it's just gonna like shred apart. Honestly, the point from the Goldees was so much more tender. Like it literally melted in my mouth. Like, not to say that the Pecos wasn't tender, but it just had like a little bit more of like a gristly texture. Like I had to like chew it a little bit more. It's actually noticeable. And then the final thing, and this is something that I look for every time I go to you know, a Texas barbecue joint, or you know, I'm cooking brisket on my own, is I'm looking for this subtle sweetness in the brisket. I think it has to do with like the fat cap or something. I'm honestly not sure, but it's like a very distinct like sweet profile you get in brisket when you're having like a real Texas style brisket. That was absolutely there on this Goldee's brisket, and it wasn't there on the Pecos. Why was it not there on the Pecos? I honestly have no clue. So all in all, the Goldee's brisket was absolutely better than the Pecos brisket. But the question is the Goldee's brisket like $3,500 better than the Pecos brisket? Honestly, I don't think that's really a fair question. You're not just getting one single brisket when you're buying both of these machines. I mean, with the Goldees offset, it's 1/4 inch thick steel, so you know it's gonna last forever. It's gonna do way better in like harsher conditions, like if it was snowing or something. And then the capacity is like unmatched. Like I can do 7 briskets on the Goldees. I can only do 1 on the Pecos. And then yeah, the quality on the Goldees brisket is way better. Again, this is just a test of 1 single brisket, but I'm pretty confident that this wasn't a fluke. So I think you're getting insane value no matter where you go. Like the fact that you can get an offset smoker for like 500 bucks and make a brisket of this quality is like insane. And then all of the features that you get with the Goldees offset for $4,000, like I think it's an insane value. So you can't go wrong with either one. It just depends on what's your budget. And remember, I cook these briskets exactly the same way. I use the Goldee style. And if you want to know exactly how I do Goldee style on a brisket, then make sure to watch the next video on your screen where I cooked a Goldee style brisket on the Goldees offset. And I'll see you guys over there.